Hey everyone, Reaper here again with another video. This time I thought I would try a little something different. I would show off my Sega Saturn Collection. So this is a video game video. For those that have been watching my channel for all these years, you know I have more than just a passing interest in video games. I've been playing them my whole life, and I do have a decent collection. So I'm going to show off my Sega Saturn games. Every now and then I add to the collection. I was fortunate enough, though, to start collecting these. I'll start right now. Here's the Albert Odyssey. I was fortunate enough to start collecting for the Sega Saturn about a year after it come out. It had come out in 1995, and you could check a lot of YouTube channels, video game YouTube channels, that discuss how the Sega Saturn had a really bad launch and all that, and what led to the failure of the Sega Saturn and all that stuff. But I was lucky enough to start collecting back in 1996, and fortunately for me, I was able to do that because nowadays collecting for the Sega Saturn is very difficult because they are very expensive. I have a decent amount of those pricey titles, but there are some that I don't have and some that I'll never have because I just refuse to pay the price for that particular game because maybe the game's not so good or just I don't feel like paying that much. But for anybody, for any video game collector out there, when it comes to the Sega Saturn, they know that it's not the easiest system to collect for. So if you see these things out in the wild, you might want to, pull out the phone and check price charting and see if it's a rare one and if you could get it for cheap to sell or to put in your own collection. So as I've been going, I know I haven't been naming them. I'll start naming a few of them, but I'm also going to put in the bottom the details about the game, like, the title and all that stuff. It's RPG or whatever. But all the games I'm showing are complete. Now, what does complete mean? Complete means more than just having the game in the instruction book. Right here, you see the instruction manual and all that. It also means having the registration card. Now, the registration card for Sega Saturn and before that Sega CD was attached to the back part of the instruction manual. So that's what it means to be complete. And some other games have other little items included, such as maybe stickers. Some come with RAM cartridges, which is mainly the Japanese games. I've showed a few Japanese games a few moments ago. I'll talk a little bit more about Japanese games in a minute. But it includes spine cards. Sometimes they came with stickers, all that stuff. So all of these are complete. Now if you notice, there are some Sega Saturn games I've showed you that are in jewel cases. They had the big ones right here. These are the ones that you're going to see for mostly when it comes to Sega Saturn collecting. But you've seen some smaller ones about the same size as a music CD or a PlayStation 1 game. Those games, and I have one coming up right now. I'll show it to you in a couple seconds. Right here. This is Fire Pro Wrestling 6-Man Scramble. The jewel case size ones. These are the Japanese releases. Okay? Now some games, Sega Saturn, like I said earlier in the video, was not popular at all in the United States. It didn't do well. But it was very popular in Japan, and they had a lot of games come out in Japan that never made it to North America because it would have been too much of a risk to bring it over to North America because fear that they wouldn't sell. And that was a legitimate fear. So anyway, you could buy some Sega Saturn games, Japanese version, for way cheaper than their American counterparts. Like this game right here. This is Guardian Heroes, a fantastic game. A lot of people in Sega collecting or in video game collecting know how great this game is. This is probably like a $200 game, but if you buy the Japanese version, it'll cost you $40. So you might say to yourself, well, why am I going to buy a Japanese version? I don't speak Japanese. True. But a lot of Japanese games have English options. And you don't really need to speak Japanese, understand Japanese to play a game, especially a fighting game like Street Fighter. There were a couple great games released in Japan, Capcom games that either are too expensive here in the United States or were never made it here, that you could still play and enjoy. Now, how do you play a Japanese game on your Sega Saturn? Well, you can either have a Japanese Saturn, which I do. I have a white, Japanese released a white Saturn among many different types of Saturns. Or you could have your regular US Saturn and put in a translation card in the background. It's like an action replay card, a Game Shark card, which will enable you to play all regions. It's very easy to do with the Sega Saturn. Okay, here we're in the middle now. Yeah, like I said, this is Legend of Oasis, great game. This came out after Beyond Oasis, but it serves as a prequel to that game. Beyond Oasis came out for the Genesis. Maybe one day I'll show my Genesis collection. I like collecting for Sega. I know a lot of people like to collect for Nintendo. Everyone's up on Nintendo. Nintendo games this, Nintendo games that, Super Nintendo this, Super Nintendo that. And they are great. But I feel Sega is also great. I like, obviously, Sega Saturn. But I also like Sega Genesis and Sega CD. Now, again, Sega CD, much like the Saturn, was not well received. It was very expensive when it came out, and a lot of people complained about the lack of quality of games that came out for that system. And I would agree, for the most part, there was a lack of quality. Excuse me if I'm delaying showing a game, just shuffling things around. There we go. But I agree that there was a lack of quality on that system, Sega CD, and some may even argue Sega Saturn. So a lot of people weren't really into it. And the thing is, with the Sega CD, it was one of the first CD released systems. So I think a lot of people were like, I don't know. And there were a lot of issues with that system too. You needed a Sega Genesis to play it. It was expensive, yada, yada, yada. So it came with a lot of baggage of issues. But Sega Saturn, I feel, is very underrated. Granted, a lot of the 3D games show their age, as all 3D games from that era do today. You play PlayStation 1 games, as much as you may like them, those 3D games like Spyro the Dragon and Tomb Raider, they look so dated and they're sometimes difficult to play. But Sega Saturn also had a ton of great 2D games. And 2D games on any system, in particular, especially the Saturn, hold up very well today. Back then, people didn't really, the developers, they were moving toward 3D. Because in Nintendo 64 and all that, they don't want to come out with 2D games. Oof, that's horrible. So they went the 3D route, which made sense. But a lot of those games do not hold up today. But when you have games that are 2D, they do hold up. And the Sega Saturn never disappoints. It was more powerful than the PlayStation when it comes to producing 2D graphics. Originally, the Sega Saturn was developed to be a 2D powerhouse, which means that they would be able to deliver the top-notch 2D graphics in the business. However, they found out that Sony, who was coming out with the Sony PlayStation, they were really focused on 3D graphics. They could do 2D graphics too really well, but they were really focusing on this next-gen 3D graphics that was most likely going to take the industry into the 2000s and beyond. And they were right. They were certainly right. So what Sega did was, they already developed the Saturn to be a 2D powerhouse. Then they went in and I believe put in another processor to try to have some more 3D power. And doing that made the system very hard for programmers to work with. It made it very difficult. And that's why you have a lot of people, developers, that really didn't want to release too much on the Sega Saturn. In addition to all the other crap that went on with the release of the Sega Saturn. So I'm starting to wind down a bit. Like I said, I have a decent collection. This is Suikoden. This is mainly known for its PlayStation release, but it also came out with the Sega Saturn. Now, can you play Suikoden? It's a Japanese. Can you play this on the Sega Saturn and understand it? Well, no. But I can because I beat the original Suikoden, a million times. So I know exactly what to do. Yeah, I got 2 copies of Terra Fantastica. I don't know how that happened. But it did. Here's an interesting game, 2D game, 3 Dirty Dwarves. Sega Saturn had a lot of interesting titles, to say the least, and unfortunately, a lot of them are very expensive, and there are a decent amount that are dirt cheap. Like this, the one I just showed you here. Now, I know I mentioned earlier, the jewel case. Does that mean it's Japanese? No, this originally came as a pack-in game with a model Sega Saturn, one of the models of Sega Saturn that was released in the United States. You could get a cheaper model, didn't come with a game, or you could get a game that came with Virtua Fighter, and it came in that jewel case. This game is infamous. Virtual Highlight is being very, very bad. I find it charming. The graphics are terrible, as it's a 3D game, as most 3D games were back then, as I was mentioning, but it's definitely worth YouTubing to look up. So yeah, Sega Saturn collecting is not that easy, but you can find some bargains and so forth. Now, with all of the grading that's going on with video games, I fear that not just collecting Sega Saturn, but collecting video games in general is going to be right up there with collecting comics. It's going to get very pricey and more difficult to do. So, like I said earlier in the video, if you see some of these, you're a gamer or you're not, try to educate yourself on them. You might want to pick some of these up. And here is the last game for the Sega Saturn, which happened to be the very first game that I bought for it, which made me want to get the Sega Saturn. I'm a comic book fan first. X-Men, Children of the Atom. Thanks everybody for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Take care.